Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about particle systems and emitter particle systems. I'm going to go over the basics of how to set up a particle system so that you can create your own effects with it. So in order to start any particle system, you need what's called an emitter. And so an emitter can be any type of mesh object. I'm going to bring in a sphere, and with your emitter, all you have to do to start your particle system is come over to your particle systems drop down and click this plus icon, and then if you click play, you see you already have particles in your scene. Now let's go over some of the basic settings of the particle system. I'm going to just let this play so that we can see what's changing. Under the emission we have number, and this indicates how many particles are going to be emitted over the course of the simulation. So if I bring that down to 5, you can see that it's pretty depressing. But then if we bring it up to like 100,000, you can see it's just this overflowing amount of particles coming out of our object. Let's switch it back to 1,000 for now. Under that, we have frame start and frame end. So if you wanted this to start on frame 20, you could choose that, and we'll just let it run through. So it's not starting until frame 20. And then we can indicate the lifetime. So if we bring that down to like 5, each of these particles is only going to be alive for 5 seconds. And likewise, if we bring it up to like 1,000, we're going to have a huge stream of particles. I'm going to switch that back to 50 again. You can also affect the lifetime randomness. And so by default, we have a lifetime of 50, but if we increase that, then some particles will be alive for 50 frames, for 30 frames. So if you want a little bit more complexity in your scene, you can add that. Okay, so if we go down and take a look at the velocity, you see that the velocity is set to 1 meters per second. So if we look at the top of our sphere, these particles are shot up a little bit, but then gravity takes a hold of them and they start falling down. If we set that to 10, you can see the particles come out a lot further before gravity starts taking a hold of them. I'm going to set that to 5 for now. Speaking of gravity, you can turn gravity on and off. So if we come up to our scene parameters, we can either affect gravity. So right now it's set to negative 9.8 meters per second squared. If we set that to negative, 20, see gravity's a lot stronger on our particles. But if we decide we don't want gravity at all, we can just switch it off, and you can see our particles just kind of emit based on the direction they were pushed out. I'm going to keep it off for now, just as we go through some of the other effects. So right now we have these kind of halo objects emitting from our emitter, but we can have any kind of mesh be emitted. So if we bring in, for instance, a Suzanne head and just kind of pull this to the side and come back to our particle system, if we scroll down to render and change render as to object and then choose Suzanne as our object, see now we have little Suzanne heads shooting out of the emitter. And we can also change, for instance, the scale of the Suzanne head or the scale randomness, so some of them will be smaller than others. But you notice they're all being shot out of our emitter with the same rotation. If we come over here and turn on rotation and switch that off, we can change the orientation axis. So you see now they're all facing the sphere, but we can also randomize kind of their orientation in space. So that's a really cool effect as well. So right now we have a pretty uniform particle system. The really cool thing is we can start to implement effects on top of this to give a little bit more complexity. For instance, I can animate this emitter and have these particles kind of respond accordingly. So if I add a keyframe here and then move it over here, add a keyframe, and then maybe animate it coming over here, and we play it back, you can see everything's being emitted based on where the sphere was at the time that particle's time was up. Furthermore, let's turn those keyframes off. We can add what are called force fields in order to affect this further. So if we click play again, if we click Shift A and go down to force fields, and let's start with wind. And so wind is basically a linear force that propels things in the direction that you specify. So if we click wind and come down to the physics tab, and if we turn the strength up, for instance, you can see the direction of the wind is compelling these particles to be emitted in that direction. If we turn that off for now and turn our particle system back on and we add, let's try vortex maybe, you can see that our particles start to kind of rotate around our object. And so really the best way to understand how they work is to just experiment and figure out what works best for you in particular. So let's delete these force fields real quick. The last thing I want to go over is how to light or shade your particles. Typically when you shade particle systems, there's some level of emission added onto it. And there are a couple of things that will be useful to go over if you want to shade your particles that way. So let's kind of freeze our frame here. And then if we click on our monkey head, we need to shade our particle object if we want these individual particles to be shaded that way. So I'm going to go over to my viewport shading, and I'm going to switch over to cycles, GPU compute, and I'm also going to turn down the strength of my world down, just so I have this complete blackness. So I have my monkey head selected. If I come over to the shader tab and click new, I'm just going to give it a really basic emission color, maybe an orange, and bring the strength way up. So you can kind of see the emission effect going on here. The one thing that's missing though is you don't see any bloom on each of these monkey heads. That's a pretty easy fix, but you have to use compositing or post-processing to get that effect. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to this view layer panel, and then I'm going to scroll down, and under other, I'm going to click emission. That will let us access the emission channel in our compositing. And then I'm going to come over to this drop down and switch over to the compositor and make sure that my use nodes checkbox is clicked. Now the last thing I have to do as setup is if I click this drop down here under compositor, I'm going to click always. That way I'll be able to see what's happening. Okay, so I'm in the compositing view, and I'm going to add a node called viewer, and that will let us see what's going to happen once we actually render our scene. So I'll pull the image into the viewer node. And so in order to get that bloom effect, we need to add a node called bloom, called glare. I'm just going to stick that in between the render layer and the viewer node. And you can already see something's happening. So right now it's using what's called streaks to add kind of that bloom effect to my scene. If I switch that to bloom, then we're going to get a classic bloom color, and we can change the strength and the saturation or even the tint if we want. And so really all of these can work, but it's really just what you're looking for in your particular scene. So you can also obviously go above the kind of 1.0 limit if you want, but that's a pretty easy way to get that bloom glow effect. And the only thing you need to remember if you're about to render is right now we have this glare effect plugged into the viewer, but if we want it to actually be rendered, we need to pull this image node into the image of our composite node, because this is actually what's going to be rendered. This is just a preview up here. Again, I just wanted to go over the basic setup of particle systems with you. I hope that helped. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with, and talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.